The German shepherd stood at the edge of the forest, ears erect, growling at the unseen. His owner laughed, just a nervous dog, right? But the air thickened, the wind stilled. Then a distant, unnatural howl shattered the night. The town of Raven's Hollow rested in a valley surrounded by dense, whispering forests. It was a place where the wind carried old secrets, where the trees bore silent witness to the things lurking beyond human understanding. For decades, the town thrived in peaceful ignorance. But Axel, the German shepherd, knew better. Axel had been with Daniel for 6 years. A rescue from a shelter, the dog had bonded with him instantly, sensing something in the man's quiet, wounded soul. Daniel, a former firefighter, had scars both visible and hidden. The loss of his wife in a tragic accident had left him hollow, drifting through life without purpose. But Axel had become his anchor, his only true family in the world. Together, they lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, where the forest loomed just beyond their backyard. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon, Axel stood at the tree line, his body tense, his hackles bristled, his ears flicking at sounds too distant for human perception. He let out a low growl, his amber eyes locked onto the darkness beyond the trees. Daniel sighed, running a tired hand through his graying hair. "Not again, buddy, it's just the wind," he muttered, stepping onto the porch with a steaming mug of coffee. The dog had been acting strange for weeks, no pacing, whining, staring into the trees like something was calling to him. Daniel chalked it up to wildlife, maybe a coyote or a bear moving through the woods. But something in Axel's stance unsettled him tonight. The wind carried a strange, scent-earthy, metallic, almost like iron. The air felt heavier, charged with something unseen. A distant rustling echoed through the woods, followed by an eerie silence. The usual night chorus crickets, owls, the distant hum of the river had vanished. Axel barked sharply, a deep, warning sound that made Daniel stiffen. The German shepherd rarely barked without reason. His instincts had saved Daniel more than once, from a collapsing structure during a rescue mission to sensing an oncoming panic attack before it overtook him. The dog had never been wrong. And yet Daniel hesitated. What could be out there? A bear? A mountain lion? He lived in these woods long enough to know when to be cautious. But this wasn't fear, it was something else, something primal, an ancient warning whispering in his bones. A crack echoed from the forest, a snapping branch, a presence, just beyond sight. Axel growled deeper, stepping forward. His body blocked Daniel protectively, his muscles taut like a coiled spring, his ears pinned back, his nose twitching furiously. He knew something Daniel didn't. Then, a sound, a low, guttural breathing from the trees. Slow, measured, watching. Daniel's heart pounded. He reached for the flashlight on the porch rail and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing, just trees. But Axel didn't move. Something was out there, and it was waiting. Sleep never came easy for Daniel, and tonight was no different. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Axel curled up beside him on the floor. The dog's ears twitched every few minutes, his breathing uneven. He was alert, even in sleep. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's windows. The unease from earlier still sat heavy in Daniel's chest. He had checked the yard twice, scanned the tree line with his flashlight, and even called out into the darkness. But there was no response. And yet, Axel still wouldn't settle. Daniel turned onto his side, eyes drifting to the small wooden box on his nightstand. Inside it, an old pocket watch rested, its cracked glass a reminder of the past he could never fix. It had belonged to his wife, Emily. She had given it to him on their wedding day, claiming it would always remind him that time was precious. But time had stolen her away. Now, the watch no longer ticked just like the life they were supposed to have together. A sharp bark snapped Daniel from his thoughts. Axel was up, body rigid, eyes locked on the front door. A low snarl rumbled from his chest. Then 3 knocks. Daniel froze. Who the hell would be at his door at this hour? His nearest neighbor was miles away, and people rarely wandered this deep into the woods. Axel's growl deepened, his teeth flashing. Daniel slid out of bed carefully, heart hammering as he grabbed the baseball bat leaning against the wall. He crept to the door, his pulse loud in his ears. Another knock, this time slower, deliberate. He inhaled sharply and opened the door. Nothing. just the dark, empty night stretching out before him. The wind rushed past, carrying that same metallic scent from earlier. Then he saw them. Footprints, deep, sunken into the damp earth, leading up to his porch, but no sign of anyone making them. Axel let out a whimper, something he rarely did, his tail tucked between his legs, a clear sign of distress. Daniel stepped outside, scanning the tree line with narrowed eyes. A strange pressure filled the air, making his skin prickle, the kind of pressure that comes before a storm or something worse. He should go inside, lock the door, ignore the feeling twisting his gut. But he didn't. Instead, he took another step forward, and the forest exhaled. A deep, rattling breath from somewhere unseen. Axel barked, lunging toward the trees. Daniel grabbed his collar just in time. Something was out there, something that wasn't human, and it was watching them. The sun barely pierced through the thick canopy of Raven's Hollow, its light a dull haze swallowed by the forest. Daniel had spent most of the morning pacing his cabin, staring at the footprints that had no origin, listening to Axel's uneasy breathing as he lay by the door, ears twitching at every sound. Something had changed. The woods, once familiar and steady, now loomed over him like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Daniel had always trusted his instincts. They had saved his life more than once. But this was different. There was no logic to it, just an oppressive feeling that something ancient and wrong had stirred beneath the trees, watching, waiting. He grabbed his hunting rifle. He wasn't sure what good it would do against an unseen thing, but holding it felt like holding onto some semblance of control. Axel watched him, eyes dark with unease. "I know, buddy," Daniel muttered, slinging the rifle over his shoulder. "Just gotta check. Make sure I'm not losing my damn mind." The dog whined, but didn't move to stop him this time. The trail of the marked. The footprints from last night were still there, crisp in the damp soil, leading to the forest's edge where they simply vanished. But something was new. Symbols. Etched into the trees, deep and jagged, fresh cuts that bled a thick, dark substance. Daniel swallowed hard as he stepped closer, running his fingers over the carved shapes. They felt wrong. A sudden gust of wind cut through the trees, carrying with it a sound that sent ice through his veins. A whisper. Not the wind, not the rustling of leaves. Something whispered his name. Daniel spun, raising his flashlight, heart hammering in his chest. The air crackled, the unnatural silence stretching too long. Axel growled. Then, just beyond the tree line, a shadow shifted. A figure. Thin, wrong, unnatural. It didn't move like a person. It flickered, as if it wasn't entirely there, slipping between the gaps in the trees with unnatural fluidity. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. His grip on the rifle tightened, every muscle in his body screaming at him to run. Then it vanished. The whispering stopped. The forest exhaled. Axel barked furiously, snapping Daniel out of his trance. "We're going back," Daniel muttered, voice tight. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he had just seen. A trick of the light? Exhaustion? A side effect of being alone in the woods for too long? None of it felt right. They made it back to the cabin without another sound. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed them. Something that hadn't finished watching. The knock at midnight. That night, the air felt heavier, pressing against the walls of the cabin like a living thing. Axel refused to sleep. He sat at the door, ears pinned back, growling low and constant. Daniel barely managed to drift off before knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Daniel shot up, heart slamming against his ribs. Axel barked, snarling, teeth flashing in the dim light. The clock read 3:12 a.m. Daniel grabbed the rifle, creeping toward the door. He peered through the window. Nothing. But the footprints were back. Deep, fresh, leading up to the porch. No sign of where they had come from. A chill crawled up Daniel's spine. Then, from the tree line, a shape moved. He couldn't make out the details, just the impression of something tall, too tall, its head tilted, unnatural, watching. Daniel's fingers tightened around the rifle. His breath came shallow. Then the thing stepped back and vanished. He shut the door, bolted it, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Something was already here. The forgotten names. Morning came, but the weight in the air didn't lift. The forest no longer felt like the place Daniel had called home for years. It felt like something else, like a mouth waiting to close. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the symbols he had scribbled onto a notepad from memory. They made no sense to him, but they made something deep inside him itch with familiarity, like he should remember. Axel sat beside him, body tense, eyes locked on the window. Then something clicked. Daniel shot up, grabbed his keys. They needed answers. The old man and the woods. The drive into town felt longer than usual. The weight of the night clung to him. He pulled into the driveway of the only person in Raven's Hollow who might know something, old man Harlan. Harlan had lived here longer than anyone. He rarely spoke to outsiders, but Daniel had helped him once, rescued him from a fire that nearly consumed his house. If anyone knew what was in the woods, it was him. The door opened before Daniel knocked. Harlan's milky eyes studied him, deep wrinkles furrowing. "You saw it, didn't you?" the old man rasped. Daniel stiffened. Harlan gestured for him to enter. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Books lined the wall, some so ancient their spines crumbled at a touch. Harlan sat heavily in his chair. "Tell me what you saw." Daniel hesitated, then told him everything. The footprints, the whispers, the thing in the woods. Harlan's face darkened. "You should have left the second that dog started warning you," he muttered. "It's marked you now." Daniel's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" Harlan sighed, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. "There's something in those woods, boy. Something old. Not a ghost. Not a man. Something worse." He gestured toward the books. "I've spent decades trying to understand it. People go missing. Others change. They start hearing things, seeing things. The forest doesn't let them go." Daniel's mind reeled. "It doesn't want the dog," Harlan muttered. "It wants you." Daniel swallowed hard. "What does it want?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. Harlan's eyes locked onto his. "It wants to remember, and it needs someone to do it." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest. He had been right. This thing wasn't just watching him. It was waiting for him to understand, to remember, to let it in. The decision. Daniel drove home with his head spinning. Harlan's words echoed in his mind. The thing in the woods had marked him. It wanted something, and it wasn't leaving until it got it. That night, he sat on the porch with Axel beside him, staring into the forest, waiting. The wind picked up. The whispers returned. The trees rustled, but not with the wind. Something was coming. And this time Daniel knew it wouldn't stop at knocking. It was coming inside. A sudden thump against the cabin wall made Daniel jolt. Axel leapt to his feet, barking wildly. The sound was deep, guttural, a noise meant for warning, not intimidation. Daniel stood slowly, his breath uneven. Another thump, this time from the window. The lantern flickered. Daniel took a step back. His mind raced through every rational explanation, but none of them fit. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't the wind. Then the knock came. Knock, knock, knock. Slow, deliberate, the same as before. Daniel's chest heaved. His pulse roared in his ears. The front door rattled slightly as if something was testing it. "Who's there?" he forced out, his voice hoarse. Silence. Thin voice. Not a whisper. Not a growl. A voice. "It's cold out here." Daniel's blood turned to ice. It was his wife's voice. "Emily." His stomach twisted so hard he thought he might vomit. His hands trembled. He hadn't heard her voice in years, not since the accident. Not since she was ripped away from him in an instant of fire and shattered metal. Axel whined. "Danny," the voice called again, soft, familiar. Wrong. He knew it wasn't real. He knew it wasn't her. But grief was a cruel thing. It twisted reality, made you doubt yourself, made you hear what you wanted so desperately to believe. His grip on the rifle wavered. "Open the door," the voice pleaded. "Please." Tears burned in his eyes. Then he saw the shadow under the door. Long, wrong, not human. He shouldn't open it. He wouldn't. But it knew him. And it knew exactly how to break him. "I miss you." A sob caught in his throat. Axel lunged suddenly, slamming into Daniel's leg, snapping him back to reality. The dog's teeth bared, his body blocking the door. Then the voice changed. It distorted, Gone was the sweet, familiar lilt of his wife. Now it was layered. Many voices, whispering over each other. The thing outside slammed against the door. Daniel staggered back. "You're not her," he hissed. The whispers hissed back. Then, silence. For several seconds, there was nothing but the wind. Then, slowly, something pressed against the window. Daniel turned, heart hammering. A face, or something close to one. It peered through the glass, twisted and stretched, its eyes nothing but black voids, its mouth too wide, lips cracked and peeling smiled. A mimicry of something it did not understand. Daniel fired. The gunshot shattered the window, glass exploding outward. But the thing was already gone. Axel whimpered. Daniel stood there, panting, sweat dripping down his back. Then, from deep in the woods, laughter. Low, hollow, like the wind through dead trees. It wasn't finished with him. Not yet. Daniel didn't sleep. He didn't dare. Instead, he spent the night by the broken window, rifle across his lap, Axel curled at his feet. The lantern burned low, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. Every so often, he heard something move outside. A slow dragging sound, a soft whisper threading through the air. It never tried the door again. Because now, it didn't have to. It had found a way in. Morning light should have brought relief. Instead, it cast long golden beams through the trees, illuminating the carvings on the trees outside. And now, there were more of them. Hundreds. Each one identical. And at the very center of the nearest tree his name, Daniel stared, cold horror creeping through his veins. It had been calling him. And he had answered. The final warning. There was only one thing left to do. Run. Daniel packed a bag, shoved supplies into the truck, and grabbed Axel's leash. They had to leave. Now. But as soon as he opened the cabin door, he stopped. His wife stood at the tree line. Emily. Smiling. Waiting. Everything inside him screamed that it wasn't real. But grief is a cruel, cruel thing. "Danny," she called softly. Axel barked wildly, snapping at Daniel's hand. Daniel clamped his eyes shut. Don't listen. Don't look. But the thing knew him. And it knew what to say. "I forgive you." Daniel choked on a breath. "I know you blame yourself." A sob tore through him. His fingers loosened on Axel's leash. And the moment they did, the world lurched. The trees rippled. The air split apart. And suddenly remembered. Emily had never died in an accident. She had died here. In these woods. Daniel had buried her. He staggered back, gasping, head spinning. Memories came flooding back. The blood on his hands. The thing in the woods whispering his name. The deal he had made. A trade. A price paid in blood. And no, it wanted another. Daniel turned, ran to the truck, yanking Axel in. He slammed the door, started the engine, tires spinning in the dirt. And as they sped down the road, he saw them. Figures standing in the trees, watching, waiting, for him to remember fully, for him to come home. But he wouldn't. Not this time. Not ever. The last thing he heard before he left Raven's Hollow behind was his own voice, calling his name, and laughing. Daniel drove. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a black ribbon cutting through the dense trees of Raven's Hollow. The early morning light barely touched the ground beneath the thick canopy, and in his rearview mirror the forest loomed like a closing fist. Axel sat in the passenger seat, panting heavily, his ears pinned back, his body coiled with tension. Every few miles he let out a low, uneasy whine, as if he could still feel the thing they had left behind. Or worse if it hadn't been left behind at all. Daniel's hands were white-knuckled on the steering wheel. His head pounded, his throat dry. The weight of his own breathing filled the cabin, heavy, uneven. Something was wrong. He had gotten away. Hadn't he? The tires hummed against the pavement, but the further he drove, the more the road felt familiar. Too familiar. His heart slammed in his chest. His mouth went dry. He glanced at the gas gauge. Half a tank left. He hadn't stopped. He had driven for miles. So why? Daniel's stomach twisted as he spotted a sign up ahead. His headlights hit the rusted metal, peeling paint barely legible through the grime. Raven's Hollow, 3 miles. His breath hitched. Number. No, no, no. That wasn't possible. He had been driving away from Raven's Hollow. He had been on the only road out of town. So how the hell was he back? A cold sweat broke out along the back of his neck. He slammed his foot on the gas. The truck roared forward, trees blurring past, his pulse hammering in his ears. Axel barked sharply, his body twisting in alarm. Daniel gritted his teeth. Go faster. Get out. Don't stop. But then, something darted across the road. Daniel yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck skidded. Tires screamed. Metal groaned. The vehicle lurched off the pavement, crashing through thick underbrush before slamming to a stop against a fallen tree. For a long, breathless moment, there was silence. Daniel gasped for air, his ribs aching from the seatbelt. The windshield was cracked, the hood steaming. Axel whimpered beside him but seemed unhurt. He exhaled, shaking. Then he saw it. The thing that had run across the road. At first, he thought it was a deer, a tall, thin silhouette in the mist. But then it stood up. A human shape, too tall, too stretched. Its head tilted slowly, like a predator studying its prey. Daniel's chest seized. He didn't breathe. The figure's face was featureless, just a void, but as it took a slow step forward, something shifted. A mouth, splitting open too wide, too deep curling into something that should have been a smile. And then, it spoke. You can't leave. The voice wasn't human. It was Laird's voice overlapping with Emily's, with 100 others he didn't recognize. Daniel couldn't move. Couldn't think. Then Axel lunged. The dog snapped, snarling, teeth flashing. The thing stepped back, its smile stretching impossibly wider. Then it melted into the fog. Daniel gasped, finally breaking free from the paralysis gripping his body. They had to move, now. He shoved the door open, stumbling out of the truck. His legs barely worked. His breath came in ragged bursts. But the worst part, he wasn't even sure which direction he had come from anymore. The road was gone. Just trees. Endless, shifting trees. Axel circled him, barking furiously, but his growls were directed all around them as if the forest itself had grown eyes. Daniel turned in a slow, agonizing circle. And then, a shape in the distance. A cabin. His cabin. His pulse stopped. No, he whispered. He had driven miles. He had left. Hadn't he? But there it was. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney. The door hung open slightly, creaking in the wind. Inside, a faint light flickered, like it had been waiting for him to come home. Axel whined, stepping backward. His tail was tucked, his body shaking. Daniel knew. If he went inside, he wasn't coming out. The thing was done playing. Now it wanted him back. His throat tightened. He could feel something behind him now. Close. Breathing. Whispering. Daniel closed his eyes. He had one chance. One choice. Runer give in. A slow, freezing breath ghosted against the back of his neck. A hand, not a real one, not human, brushed his shoulder. And the thing spoke again. It's easier if you remember. Daniel's vision blurred. Memories rushed back, blood, the deal, the thing that had taken Emily in his place. It had never stopped hunting him. Because it owned him. And it was finally calling in its debt. He turned. The thing grinned. Axel snapped his jaws, then ran. Daniel followed. Blind, desperate. Into the trees. Away from the cabin that wasn't real. Away from the thing that had been whispering his name for years. He ran. And the forest laughed. Daniel ran. Branches clawed at his face, thorns tearing into his skin, but he didn't stop. Axel was ahead of him, a blur of black and tan, his powerful legs cutting through the undergrowth with frantic speed. The wind roared through the trees, but underneath it, beneath the rustling leaves and snapping twigs, was laughter. Not human. Not real. But there, mocking. Daniel's breath burned in his throat. His legs felt like lead, his vision swimming, but the thing was behind him, just beyond the edges of his sight. He refused to turn around. He wouldn't. Because if he did, he knew he'd never stop running. Axel barked sharply, veering left. Daniel followed, trusting the dog more than his own instincts. He had to get to the road. Had to get out. But every direction looked the same. Was this the same path? Had they already passed that tree? His pulse slammed against his ribs. The panic clawed at his chest, making his breaths ragged and uneven. Then, a shadow moved ahead of him. Daniel skidded to a stop, nearly falling. Axel snarled, his teeth bared, his body rigid with warning. The shadow was tall, too tall. It flickered, shifting between the trees like smoke curling through the cracks of the world. And then, it took a step forward. Daniel took a step back. The thing tilted its head. And then it spoke. "You were always meant to stay." Daniel fired. The gunshot shattered the silence. The recoil slammed against his shoulder. But the figure didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. The bullet had passed through it. Daniel's stomach dropped. And then it moved. Fast. Too fast. It closed the distance in seconds. Daniel barely had time to react before a force slammed into his chest. He crashed backward, the rifle flying from his grasp. Axel lunged at the thing, snapping, biting, but it didn't react. It simply turned its head toward the dog. Axel's bark cut off mid-snarl. His body went rigid. A horrible whimper broke from his throat. And then he collapsed. Daniel's scream ripped from his chest. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing Axel, shaking him. No. The dog's body was limp, his breath shallow. His eyes were open, but they were wrong. Distant. Lost. Like something inside him had been taken. Daniel turned. The thing stood just inches away now. It grinned. Daniel's breath came in ragged bursts, his hands shaking violently as he held onto Axel's still warm body. "You were always meant to stay," the thing whispered again. Daniel closed his eyes. Memories rushed in. The truth he had been avoiding. The deal. The price. The thing had let him leave before. But only because he had left something behind. Emily. Her face flashed in his mind. The night she had disappeared. The whispers that had taken her name, her voice, her face. The lie he had told himself that she had died in an accident. Number? She had never died at all. She had simply become one of them. The thing took another step forward. Daniel's knees buckled. Axel let out a faint whimper, barely clinging to consciousness. The thing crouched beside them and whispered, "You can have her back." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The forest held its breath, waiting. His heart pounded, his hands tightening around Axel's unmoving body. He knew what it meant. A trade. A life for a life. His dog for his wife. Daniel's vision blurred. Axel had never left his side. He had warned him, protected him. He had given Daniel a reason to keep going. And now, Daniel's fingers twitched. He could say yes. He could have Emily back. All he had to do was let go. His hands shook. His vision swam. He couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. Then, a noise. A familiar noise. A heartbeat. Faint, steady. Under his hand, Axel's chest still rose. Still fought. The dog hadn't given up. And neither would he. Daniel sucked in a breath. His hands tightened around Axel's fur. His pulse slowed. And for the first time he stopped listening. To the whispers. To the promises. To the thing in front of him. "No," he said. The forest stirred. The thing's head snapped up. Daniel stood. "You can't have him," he growled. The thing smiled wider. And then, the world shook. The trees bent backward, screaming as the sky split open. The thing reached for him, and Daniel ran. The forest came alive. Daniel ran. Behind him, the trees twisted, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers, snapping and clawing at the air. The ground pulsed beneath his feet, shifting, breaking apart like something alive. Axel was draped in his arms, his breath weak but steady. And the thing was coming. It didn't move like a man. It didn't even move like something bound by this world. It flowed, bending through the trees like liquid shadow, flickering in and out of existence. And it was closing in fast. Daniel's lungs burned, his heart pounded. The weight of Axel slowed him, but he wouldn't leave him behind. He couldn't. He wouldn't trade him for anything. Not even Emily. The thought sent a fresh jolt of agony through him. Because Noe remembered. She had begged him to leave. The last night he saw her, the way her hands had trembled when she grabbed his shirt, shaking him, whispering, "Don't listen, Danny, don't let it in." But he had. He had stayed when she ran. And the forest had claimed her instead. Now, it wanted to finish what it started. Something shrieked behind him, an ear-splitting, warped sound, 1,000 voices woven into one, screaming his name. Daniel skidded around a tree, nearly stumbling over a root. A headlight. A break in the trees. The road. He sprinted harder, pushing his body past its limit. He could make it. He could still get out. But then, the ground split open. The dirt caved inward, a dark, gaping hole tearing through the forest floor like a wound. Daniel skidded to a stop, his boots slipping on the edge. Axel let out a weak whimper in his arms. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. The hole wasn't just black. It was empty. A space where the world simply ceased to exist. And it was growing. Behind him, the thing laughed. Daniel's fingers tightened around Axel. He had one chance. One shot. He turned, breath-heaving, heart-pounding. The thing stood at the tree line now, tall and wrong, shifting like it couldn't decide what shape to take. Its grin stretched too wide, splitting open like a wound. "You can't leave," it whispered. Daniel's grip tightened on Axel. "Yes, I can." And then he jumped. Over the hole. His body lurched forward, weightless, air rushing past him. For a heartbeat, he thought he wouldn't make it. Then, solid ground. He hit hard, rolling, keeping Axel pressed against him. Pain jolted through his shoulder, his ribs, but he didn't stop. He kept running. The trees screamed. The thing roared. The road was right there. One more step. And then, the world snapped. The air split open, a force so strong it nearly ripped him backward. But Daniel threw himself forward. His boots hit pavement, and everything stopped. The forest vanished. The wind died. The whispers cut off like a severed lifeline. Daniel collapsed onto the road, his chest heaving, his pulse roaring in his ears. The sky above was pale, empty of stars. The sun was rising. Axel let out a weak, shuddering breath. Daniel pulled him close, pressing his forehead to the dog's. "We made it," he gasped. But he didn't dare look back. Because he knew. The forest was still there. Still watching. Still waiting. And one day, it would call for him again. But he would never answer. The first thing Daniel did when he reached town was take Axel to the vet. The clinic was small, tucked between an old diner and a boarded-up general store. But at that moment, it was the only place in the world that mattered. Daniel had barely stepped inside before Dr. Holloway, a woman in her 60s with sharp blue eyes, ushered them into the back room. She didn't ask any questions probably because one look at Daniel told her she wouldn't get any answers. Axel lay on the exam table, unmoving except for the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest. His fur was damp with sweat, his body unnaturally still. Daniel hovered beside him, fists clenched, heart hammering. "He won't wake up," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, raw from lack of sleep. "He's breathing, he's alive, but he won't wake up." Dr. Holloway pressed her stethoscope to Axel's side, listening. Her face remained unreadable, her movements steady and practiced. After a few long moments she straightened, exhaling through her nose. "His vitals are stable," she said. "There's no sign of physical trauma, no infection. Blood pressure is normal, but—" She hesitated. "It's almost like something drained him." Daniel's stomach twisted. Drained. Like the thing had taken something from him. Like it had fed. Daniel swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. "What does that mean?" Dr. Holloway frowned. "It means that, medically speaking, there's nothing wrong with him. But something has affected him. I've seen animals in shock before, but this feels different." She met his eyes. "I've never seen a case like this." Daniel's throat tightened. Because he had. He had seen what the forest could do. Axel was still here, but part of him was somewhere else. Still trapped in the dark. Ghosts that still whisper. Daniel didn't leave the clinic. Dr. Holloway told him to go home, to rest, but he refused. He stayed by Axel's side, his hand resting on the dog's unmoving body. He had lost too much already. He wasn't going to lose Axel too. The hours blurred together. At some point, Dr. Holloway left, leaving him alone in the dimly lit room. Rain tapped against the window, a soft rhythmic sound that should have been soothing. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. He could still feel the weight of the forest, still hear the echo of its whispers. He knew he had escaped. But had he? The forest had let him go, but not for free. It had taken Emily. And deep down he knew she was still there, waiting. The first sign. It happened at 3:12 a.m. Daniel sat in the chair beside Axel's table, exhaustion pressing heavy against his shoulders. His body begged for sleep, but his mind wouldn't let him close his eyes. Then, Axel twitched. Daniel sat up, heart pounding. The dog's paw jerked slightly, his nose scrunching as if he were caught in a dream. Then a sound. Faint. Distant. Like the wind moving through trees. Daniel's stomach dropped. Because it wasn't the wind. It was a whisper. Muffled, almost too quiet to hear. But he knew that voice. Emily. Daniel's entire body went rigid. His breath came fast, shallow. He turned slowly, his eyes locked on the dark window across the room. Nothing. Just the night, the rain. Then, a shape in the glass. A reflection that wasn't his. Daniel's pulse stopped. Emily. She was standing behind him, watching, waiting, and smiling. The decision. Morning came, but the weight in Daniel's chest didn't lift. He knew what had to be done. Axel was alive, but he wasn't whole. The forest still had a piece of him. And Emily. She was still in there, waiting. Daniel sat in his truck, staring at the road ahead. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows over the pavement. Axel sat in the passenger seat, his head resting against Daniel's thigh. He was awake now, his breathing slow but steady. But his eyes were different. Still distant, still lost. Daniel clenched the steering wheel. He knew what it meant. The forest had marked him. It had let him go, but not fully. Not forever. And if he didn't go back, it would take Axel completely. The road back. The drive felt endless. Axel sat up now, his ears flicking at every sound. He wasn't whining, but Daniel could feel it, the unspoken warning vibrating through his body. They reached the edge of Raven's Hollow just after noon. The trees loomed ahead, stretching high, swallowing the sky. The road ended here. Beyond it, the forest. Daniel put the truck in park, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached. Axel let out a soft, uneasy whine. Daniel exhaled slowly. Then he opened the door. The air was wrong. Too still, too quiet. He took a slow step forward, the damp earth soft beneath his boots. The scent of pine filled his lungs. He shouldn't be here. He knew that. But he wasn't leaving without Axel. And he wasn't leaving without her. Daniel turned toward the trees, his breath fogging in the cold air. He listened. The forest watched, waited. And then, the wind sighed. A whisper threaded through the air, curling around his ears like smoke. Danny. His throat tightened. Axel pressed against his leg, his warm body grounding him. Daniel exhaled. Then, he turned and walked away. Final line. The forest didn't stop him, but it smiled, because it knew. One day he'd come back. Some places never let go. Some voices never stop whispering. What would you do if the thing you lost was still out there, calling your name? Would you go back? Or would you run? If this story left you haunted, leave a comment below. What do you think the forest wanted? Don't forget to like and subscribe, because some stories aren't meant to be forgotten, and neither are the things that still wait in the dark.